So let me just double check here. Egyptology, contemplation. So don't worry, those tabs, those are just my research documentations. So yeah. All right, so we're just waiting for a few people. I'm going to quickly discuss the Adlifar. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so we're just going to discuss the origin. So if you go to this website, you see the time period set by the academics in regards to Egypt's history. Now, Egypt doesn't really start until the early dynasty, which is around 3100 BC. Anything before that is still kind of in the Nakad period, the non-unification of Egypt. So always understand that anything before that. But here and on the right side over here, you'll see the amount of time that each period lasted. So the early dynasties were about 400. The Old Kingdom was 500. First intermediary destabilization was about 150. Middle Kingdom, you can see, period, and on and on and on and on. And it shows you all the way down to the Ottoman and even the Islamic period and the Roman Byzantium periods, which probably far were the longest ruling powers at that time. So let's begin by just quickly going through this. It's only going to take about 15 minutes. I'll try to load it up on YouTube for everybody. So here we go. All right, so we're not going to get into the Paleolithic unless you like pottery and you like looking at different type of shards of pottery, of different type of food or different agricultural type of equipment. That's where you'll find most of it here. So way before Egypt was actually ever a unified or even a cultural identity in itself, before even pharaohs existed, you would probably go over here. So you just click on it and you'd see different parts of the culture. I don't usually delve to this. This is way too early for me in that time period. But if we go to the last one, the Ma'adi or even the Badarian, you'll see, hopefully it'll open up. I have my Wi-Fi on. Yeah, so you'll see a little bit of the type of tools and beads that were discovered in that time period. It doesn't really tell you it's Egyptian. It just shows you something of a culture that was then at Upper Egypt. So it says earliest evidence of farming in Upper Egypt. So you see a little bit of that. So this is an example of discovery. This is more in the archaeological area. They are the specialists. They were able to identify, and that's usually agricultural or farming or even gather hunting tools for hunting. So those are usually the things. Sometimes they may see signs, but writing itself did not come into effect in that time period. You may see drawings on pottery, but not real actual hieroglyphs or even an idea of a cultural identity yet. Now we move into the Nakad area, which we call the first, which is the Nakad period. It is considered the pre-dynastic, the pre-unification of Egypt as a single nation. And you have the Nakad 1, 2, and 3. When you click on that, here it'll show you the kind of the rulers and the names. But here you'll see the different things in that time period. Very interesting read to learn about it. Pottery is one of the big ones. You see the different type of arts or beads or jewelry or farming or agricultural tools that was used, or just cultural tools that were used by people that were actually domesticated in the land. They basically harvested the land. They were no longer gatherer hunters, but they were actually more agricultural. They basically worked the land, worked the grain, made food. They no longer became nomads. They were isolated in their region. Now, in the Nakad period, people lived around the Water Nile. They were everywhere around the area. You can find them from north to south. So when you go through the three Nakad periods, you'll see different types of things. And usually the most identifiable thing is the pottery. Usually for the first Nakad, the pottery is simple. By Nakad 2, it had drawings on it like that. And by Nakad 3, it had like handles. So a lot of decorative things. And that's how the Nakad periods were kind of organized in that order. Now we get into the part that everyone loves, is when we get into the... see if I can zoom that out a little. We get into the periods. Now, the Nakad period, I'll just show you over here. That, by estimates, and this changes all the time by the different academics, range between about 800 years of Egyptians developing their personality, their myths, their belief systems, their culture itself, but not really becoming a fully unified religion in itself or even a full culture until it's called the Early Dynastic, the early Egyptian dynastic period, which lasted about 400 years and was prior to the Old Kingdom. So let's look at the early dynastic period. This basically gives you the king list. Now, there is no really, there is an attestation here, but very, very brief. And usually these are, let's see if I can get that into focus. Okay, great. These are about pharaohs from possibly the Zero Dynasty, which, we all know Namre was considered the first. And then we enter the first dynasty. He's the first true unifying pharaoh from very little evidence that we have back then. We don't have a lot. Remember, Egypt is pieced together from many types of periods and many different things. So our understanding of Egypt is constantly growing, and its history itself is constantly growing. So here you have a possible, for example, the crocodile god, Ka, the Scorpion King, which I'm sure you've all seen the movie. So, if we click on the Scorpion King, he was before the first dynasty, the Zero Dynasty. And, you read a little bit about it. There may not be any pictures, but it'll guide you to sources and books about this actual person. So there was an attestation an idea that we may have something of him written on pottery. It's just not in here, but that's how we know. But let's go to Namre. He is considered by far the first of the true pharaohs, and you see there's a lot of things for him. Basically his cartouche name. I don't know if it's in here, but the famous palette. And you see here is one of the earliest king lists that they had, very early. And you could see the Namre name, which was pretty much the piece that was over here. And that's how they identify. You can see the Namre name in here. Here it basically means mighty catfish or striking catfish. And you can see his many different cartouches that are tested. So you could check it out. But that's the only real beginnings of, and you see the many scholars that indicate many different things about him and where we find the many inscriptions. So the Namre Palette was by far the most famous. I'm sure you all know this when you see it right now. This is the Namre Palette. I'm sure you all know what it is. Some of you have done the research. And this is basically how it tells us that this is Namre. His name is written right up there. I don't know if you could see that right up there. So this is the first true pharaoh of Egypt, the unifier, the conqueror, from what is considered in ancient times. All right, let's go back. If I can go back. Sometimes this thing's a little... Yeah, there it is. All right, so let's move into a quick synopsis of the culture. So you could see there the first dynasties start to appear, and then the second dynasty, and then eventually the second dynasties, which are early pharaohs from the early times, very small attestations to their names. But let's get into the actual first dynasty pharaoh here. So now we get into the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom, you can see here the third dynasty. You have Djoser from the Step Pyramid. The first true Step Pyramid was built. Back in the first, second, third dynasties, people were buried in the sand itself. By second dynasty, there were mastabas built, basically flat blocks that were built, and people would be buried in solid rock, from sand to solid rock. And by the time Djoser came along, now you begin to have the semblance of pyramids being built. Djoser basically put multiple mastabas on top of themselves, creating almost like a wedding cake, and became a pyramid. And if I click on Djoser, just to show you Djoser, I'm only going to click on people that are important or significant enough. Now, it's not in here, but you have Imhotep. Imhotep is the creator of the Step Pyramid of Djoser. He is famous throughout the movies that you see, but he's known as a very important person that was eventually deified. Here's the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. Again, a great website to do your research and learn about the history. I don't know if there's an image here. No, it's just the schematic, but that's the Step Pyramid right there. But just Google it, you'll find it. I'm sure I can find something over here, but I won't really take too much time with that because I want to get through the history. It's a quite large history and try to do a synopsis. And then by the fourth dynasty, you get into Snefru, Khufu, and Khafre and Menkaure. You know Snefru's Red Pyramid. Khufu is the greatest pyramid at Giza Plateau. That's the main pharaoh of the fourth dynasty. Khafre, his son, and then he builds the second, and then Menkaure has the third. And then you get into the fifth dynasty pharaohs, and then the first hieroglyphs ever carved on anything inside the pyramid of Unis. And then he is the first. He has the largest inscriptions of hieroglyphs carved inside his pyramid. And then you have Teti, Pepi, and Pepi II. Menrenre, I don't think he has any attested hieroglyphs. By the sixth dynasty, this is the Old Kingdom. This is the time period for that Old Kingdom. All right, let's go back. Now, from the Old Kingdom, after Pepi II, who ruled for a very long time, Egypt suddenly out of somewhere collapses. Remember, now as we get further down the history, we get more and more information, but the records are very slim by this time. So we get into the first intermediary period, which lasted about 150 years. We have three intermediary periods in Egypt. We have the first, the second, and the third, and they mean destabilization. Egypt is not unified under one banner, okay? Egypt is basically, the webpage is, UCLA, just go University College of London. You can see it right up there, guys, okay? I'm trying to just read your, how are you today? I'm great fan. Thank you for being a fan, everybody. I appreciate it. Very interesting. Greeting from Aswan. Hello, what's the name of the page? Yes, awesome. Hi, guys. Cool, ancient lineage, traces back, drug up. Not sure what that is. Let's be respectful on the page for everybody who's trying to learn, everybody. Let me just go through, I'm sorry, I'm just going through the comments here. I don't think I missed everything. Okay, great, we're up to date. Got it, thank you. All right, much love, guys. Thank you, Duxia. Okay, here we go. So continuing on, the first intermediary period lasted about 150 years. Remember, these dates change all the time. This is by far one of the best sources of updated information when it comes to archaeological sites. So you could see the evidence for those time periods. So let me just go through the kings first. First intermediary period. We're not going to go too much into it. This is a destabilization. This is a time where Manetho, he was an Egyptian who lived during that period of time, counted that the kings lived about 70 days each one of them. You can see just a list of them. We have very little information about them. We have their attestations written about on king lists. Very little about them. From the 8th dynasty, 9 to 10, then the 10th dynasty. But only when we get to the 11th dynasty do we begin to see something, the 3 Intefs. And we begin to see a little bit of actual proper ruling. They ruled more in the south. This is, again, still destabilized. Egypt is in its first intermediary. It could be civil war, chaos. It could be the economy collapsed, just destabilization. People basically started getting greedy and attacking each other and not believing in the unity of Egypt. So different rulers at that time. That's the first intermediary period. Now, the Middle Kingdom comes. Now, the Middle Kingdom is considered by far the most conservative of the period. That lasted 325 years. Let me see if I can get anything out of the intermediary period. So you can see like different kings of the intermediary period. It says that after a long reign of Pepi II, Egypt separated into 2 political units. It's always usually divisions between north and south all the time. So there's always a division between the two. And you could see it in the pottery production, the coffins, relief carvings in stone, country reunited. And then the country was eventually reunited in the 11th dynasty, and that was under Montuhotep II. And eventually Hatshepsut will mimic Montuhotep because of he is the first to unify Egypt when it collapsed on itself. So he is the unifier. There are a few unifiers in ancient Egypt. So you'll see their names coming up. So by the Middle Kingdom, which lasted about 325 years, you have the Montuhotep. He basically unifies Egypt in the 11th dynasty. And then the other 4 Montuhoteps. And then you enter into, I'm not going to get too much into it, but you get into Senusret I. He is famous for building the first obelisk in Egypt. And then you get the Amenemhats. And Amenemhat, just the names tell you what's going on. Montuhotep, Montu is basically a war god. This is a much older god from that period of time. The war gods later have different attributes. There are many gods that have war titles, but Montuhotep was the first. That it means Montuhotep is satisfied. So this was a wartime. The names of the pharaoh tell you what's happening in that time period. And Senusret I, and so on and so forth, the Amenemhats, and there's even a Sobek Nefru, the beautiful Sobek. There were pharaohs named after Sobek, the crocodile god. All right, Middle Kingdom. A couple of points about the Middle Kingdom. It's considered the height of Egyptian. Here's some stuff about the Middle Kingdom so you could see, UCLA. The Middle Kingdom had the best writing. It was considered, even today when we learn hieroglyphs, we learn the Middle Kingdom first. It's considered the highest and the best of standard. Much of the statues are very conservative, very traditional. There is some deviation from the art itself, but not much. And this is some of the art pieces you can have a look at. I'm not going to go too much into it, but that's the Middle Kingdom. Now, the Middle Kingdom lasts about 325 years, and then there's a second intermediary period, another collapse in Egypt. Let's click on it and see what it says about the collapse. Now, what is this collapse of the second period after 325 years of Egypt? Well, the general agreement between Egyptologists for the second intermediary period collapse, including the 13th to the 17th dynasty. All right, now our dynasties are divided according to us. It doesn't mean the Egyptians did it this way. That's just how we divide things. So historical moment became political divide by the time it hit the 13th dynasty. There is some information to show us what's been divided. But they say perhaps there is a division along the eastern fringes. Now, I'm trying to remember what happened. So this is the first true invasion of Egypt by the second collapse. The first intermediary period had a collapse because of the ruling factions or political instability within the country. But by the second intermediary period, you had an outsider invader. You had something known as the 15th dynasty. As Egypt was weakening and breaking down central power, invading forces came from the north. They are known as the Hexos, which I'm sure you all know. The later accounts known, their name was pronounced in Egyptian as Hekau Hasut, or rulers of the foreign lands. All right. And what happened was, eventually they invaded Egypt. They brought a new weapon called a chariot and other type of weapons, and they basically dominated Egypt for at least 150 years. They set up their capital in the Delta in the north, which is lower Egypt, and it's in Avaris. So you'll see where that location is. The Hyksos basically were considered by a variant of the Palestinian Middle Bronze Age period. So they're pretty much considered by that, but that could change all the time. The Hyksos were Egyptian kings. They maintained their capital at the capital of Thebes, even though they ruled from Avaris and the southern part of Egypt as well. Now, the Theban kings eventually defeated the Hyksos, right? They eventually defeated the Hyksos and kicked them out. It took a few succession of pharaohs to do that. Let's go back and I'll tell you how it happened. If you go to the second intermediary period, which lasted about 150 years, I see the pharaohs are not indicated here. Maybe because they were positioned in the new kingdom. I could be wrong. Yeah, they forgot the king. I'm not sure why they did that, but they should have had the intermediary pharaohs. Let me click on that again. All right, so there is a list, but I'd say maybe go to another site for that. I'm surprised they didn't have a list here, at least of some pharaohs. So the two pharaohs which are more prominently, there was other good ones, but the most prominent of that period who actually started the revolt against the Hyksos was Sekenretau II. What he did was he began the revolt against the Hyksos. But first he targeted it towards the Nubians in the south, because the Hyksos and the Nubians in Sudan came together to attack Egypt itself, to keep it destabilized. But it started with him. Thank you very much, Organize This. And what they did is they fought together to be able to attack Egypt. So starting with Sekenretau II, he began the attack the south, and eventually he was captured by the Hyksos, tortured and killed. And you can see his body in online, I think in the Egyptian Museum, which has severe damage to it, so you know that he suffered battle wounds. And then his son, Kamose continued the battle, pushing out the Nubians and then attacking the Hyksos, but he died as well. It wasn't until when we established the new kingdom of Egypt, which lasted 500 years, this is during the Ramzidian period and so on. Ahmose was the brother of Kamose, and he basically kicked out the Hyksos officially, and they were gone. The expulsion of the Hyksos from northern Egypt, and later the campaign in the south and Palestine, in south of Palestine, and then in Nubia. So he attacked them in Palestine and then attacked them in Nubia. And they were pretty much gone from there. And this is the attestation here from Ahmose. This is Ahmose's name right over here. All right, so that's it. Ahmose is the first liberator of Egypt. So he liberated Egypt. You can see now the beautiful dynasties, the three beautiful dynasties of the New Kingdom. You have the 18th dynasty, which is probably one of the nicest, and the 19th, of course. The 20th is the decline. And I'll just go through this one pretty quickly. So Ahmose, Amenhotep's, this is pretty much the golden age of ancient Egypt, the golden age. Of course, you all know Hatshepsut right over here. Thutmose the first being her father. This is her husband. When he died, she ruled. Then when she died, Thutmose ruled. And then Amenhotep, Thutmose the fourth, and then Amenhotep the third, which did a lot of construction and monuments. Thutmose the third is known as the warrior king. And then after Thutmose the fourth, you had Akhenaten, who became the heretic king, the famous king that broke down the old culture of ancient Egypt and started his own religion, his single. And then, of course, Smenkhare, which was the next in line to rule and died early, but then Tutankhamun. We all know Tutankhamun. He ruled after, and then the vizier I died, and then Horemheb, who was a simple soldier who became pharaoh. And then when he died, he had no children. And then Ramses the first, who died early, and then Seti. Then I'm losing that. And then you recognize Ramses II, the great Ramses from the 19th dynasty, and then all the way to Seti II. And then you enter into the Ramzidian period, There are 11 Ramses, guys, so don't let people tell you there's 10. There's 11 Ramses. So now you have 11 Ramses. So this is the golden age. But then by Ramses the Third, that's when the collapse began of the 20th dynasty, and not into a intermediary period yet, but into the golden age. So the golden age stopped here, and then it was a slow, gradual decline of weak rulers who didn't keep the strength of Egypt. More and more of the power of Egypt went to the priests, and eventually the pharaonic power decreased, and the stabilization began to happen once again. And then eventually it started breaking into specific powers from north and south. Pharaohs lost the ability to rule both regions of Egypt. And that's how it works. All history is like that. In any country, in any empire, even today, when you see a country divide, then you know that it's going downhill. So for example, just an example, if you see one day the United States of America begin to divide itself into two nations, it's coming downhill. Canada, the same where I live. Any country that divides itself will inevitably lead to a full decline and then full-on invasions by people who will see the weakness. And that's how it works. Weakness is not a good thing in ancient times. Now, the New Kingdom lasted 500 years. There's other things here in the New Kingdom I won't show you. For all those, it's up there, guys. University College of London. Just check that one out. After that, we get the third intermediary period, which is another destabilization and collapse. And then what we have here now is the ruling power of the priests. And then you can go throughout the history here, but this is where you get an assortment of Libyans and Cushite rulers who begin to take over Egypt itself. Here, we don't get into the Nubians just yet until we get to, down here, the 25th dynasty. So from the stabilization of Egypt, where there isn't one ruler of Egypt, you begin to see the 21st dynasty of priests. These were the priest kings. They ruled Egypt for about 100 years. They basically named themselves priests. This is the time where you see Amun actually really prominent in Egypt, becoming the true state god. Even though he was a state god, he was incorporated before, but he became officially a state god. And then you have the dynasty 2 of Shashank or Sakan, Takalot. These are people of Libyan descent, and they set up themselves in Tanis, which is also in the Delta. And then you get to Upper Egypt again. Remember, you have the Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt. You have divisions. You have many different aspects of ancient Egypt. Not going to go too much into it. And then that's the 22nd dynasty. You get into the 23rd dynasty, which enters into the Sais period. So people living in the Sais area. You have people living in Bubastis area. People still living in Tanis by this time period, the 23rd. And you can read more about them. Just click on them and you get some information. Then you get to a very small reigning period. I'm not sure why the Egyptologists divide this. Not very, very crucial or important, but it sure had some significance in it. It was the dynasty 24. And then you get into dynasty 25. These are the 100-year ruling period of the Nubians. So this is the Sudanese people, the Nubian people of the south. Under P, Shabaka, Shabeko, Taharka. They say Taharko. But these people were the Nubians. They were the Cushites. They ruled from Napata down at the south of the probably 4th or 5th cataract or 3rd cataract. And they basically were known as the pious. They didn't really destroy Egypt. They had Egypt in their culture for so long. They were neighbors to the south. They incorporated much of what their culture is from Egypt. And eventually when they conquered Egypt, when it was weak and destabilized, what they did was just make Egypt better. They rebuilt the temples. There's a lot of indication of that they actually respected and cared about the Egyptian gods themselves because it was part of their history as well. All right, so that is the intermediary period. So now we are in the third intermediary period, the third collapse, and this is the end of the collapse. Now, the golden age is gone. Egypt doesn't rise again after Ramses III of the New Kingdom. We get into the late period. The late period enters into a stage of not destabilization, but very confused ruling periods. I'm not going to go too much into this one, but this is, again, a period that has some good rulers. It did have actually good. Psamtik I was probably a very excellent ruler at that time. And this is the time when Demotic language comes out. So Demotic is another script that was being written at this time. And these are pretty good rulers of this time. Again, there was a lot of destabilization as well, not as strong. A lot of warring factions. Sometimes the the rulings were divided into two. So a late period entered into a time that was just dwindling. So, you're talking about the New Kingdom lasting 500 years, the Third Intermediary, 400 years of destabilization. That does a big effect, because the First Intermediary lost about 150 years, the second about 150 years, 3-4 generations, but then 400 years for the Third Intermediary Period, which could create a sizable problem when you get to that length of time of people forgetting what a true unified Egypt looked like. By the late period, there was a connection, but it was really supported by other nations, helping Egypt to rise above itself. But it really wasn't as strong as it was. It wasn't going to last. It lasted about 139 years before now you get the first. So you had the Hexos, you had Libyans, you had Cushites, you had Nubian invaders. Eventually they were all pushed out or integrated with Egypt. But then you had a true outsider from Egypt, a true outsider from the land of Egypt or surrounding Egypt. Because before you had Egypt, then you had Nubians in the south, and you had Cushites, which were the Cushites, and you had Libyans, and then you had the Hittites coming in from the top here. But they were all in that same area, kind of not the same, but different. But the Libyans were close to Egypt, and so were the Nubians. But now you're getting the first Persian assault on Egypt. Now, the first Persian one lasted about pretty long. The first is the longest, 121 years, the Persian occupation of Egypt. And it was under Cambyses. You can see here the names, Cambyses, Darius. We don't have any attestation. We just have records that they ruled in Persia. So we know they ruled Persia, and we know they conquered Egypt. So we know that they were the rulers there, but we don't have much attestation to their names. It's not only until the second Persian conquest. These Persians were good Persians. They ruled Egypt quite well. They helped rebuild the temples. They respected the culture in itself on the most part. And they did whatever they could to keep the peace with Egypt and make sure that Egypt was a vassal and maintained itself, but it wasn't important to the Persians. Persia was quite large at this time. It was huge. It occupied great power in the land, and it was a country or a culture of great advancement and great sophistication when it came to a culture like that. So when Egypt was dwindling down, Persia was quite strong and quite intelligent during this particular time period, doing very well for itself as a culture and identity. All right, guys, let's keep it respectful. Okay, you're gone, Sean. Yeah, no, don't disrespect each other like that. It's not very polite, guys. This is not a page for insult. All right, once you enter the Persian period, now what happens is a resurgence. The Persians get pushed out. This is the late Persian. This is considered the late period again, a later period of ancient Egypt. This is where you have people like Amartius, right? A Greek form of Amarnides. And these people push out the Persians. The Persians are pushed out. No problem, guys. Yeah, the Persians are out. Questions later, guys. So the Persians are pushed out. And then there's a small rule in Egypt again amongst very small dynasties. But the dynasties aren't that great. They're not very strongly ruled. They're actually more trying to maintain the invaders again, trying to make sure that there's a lot of war and no fighting. Again, the detail, you can read some of that history, but Dynasty 28, 29, and finally Dynasty 30 is considered the last dynasty of ancient Egypt, the last rulers of ancient Egypt. And they were native, but not truly native. They were a combination of mixed races at this time. There wasn't really a purity in ancient Egypt. Everybody was pretty much mixed. But the culture itself became diluted, mixed with Persian influence, mixed with even Greek influence at that time. And it was kind of becoming something less than what it was. So we get the second Persian period. By the second Persian period, this wasn't the nicest period for Egyptians to be treated. This was now a time where the Egyptians were being locked down. They were being controlled. Their temples were being destroyed. They were basically being dominated. They weren't permitted to have anything because of what they did the first time. They pushed them out, and they pushed them out. So basically an ungrateful cult, sadly for the Egyptians who if you attack the lion, then the lion will bite you back when he's healed. And that's what the Persians did at this time. And the Egyptians were fed up of them. They didn't give them any rights. There was a lot of animosity towards the Persians at this time. But the Persians were weakening at this time. By Darius III, the Persian Empire was slowly dwindling as well. It was losing its ability to govern properly and rule with weak rulers and destabilization for them as well. It was a change for them now. It's their turn to see their decline for that type of culture at the time. Now we enter into the Persian. Now, the Persian invasion, which happened twice, so we have the Libyans, we have the Nubians, they have the Hexos, the Libyans, and the Nubians, the three types of invading into Egypt. And then we had the Persians, which is the fourth. But now we get a new type of ruler, a new type of conqueror or liberator, whichever one you want. Now enter the Macedonian. Remember, let me just go through the first Persian, which is 121 years. Egypt was able to keep the Persians out for about 60 years, and they came back for about 11 years. But then the Macedonians came, and the Macedonians, who were of Greek descent, and they are from the line of Alexander. So the generals and armies of Alexander, you can see here Alexander the Great, who basically conquered Egypt, but he didn't stay very long. He just conquered it. And then you see his son, Alexander IV, who didn't really live in Egypt as well. He died pretty early, too, by the generals. He was assassinated by one of the generals. And then that was it. So the conquest of Macedon by Alexander, that lasted, I think, about 27 years. That's it. So Egypt was under Macedonian rule for 27 years. But by this time, what was happening is the generals were fighting amongst each other. Egypt was being controlled and fought over like children, trying to who can break up the pieces of Macedonia. And that's what happened. But then you had Ptolemy, which was a general and a very close friend of Alexander the Great, and he is slowly but surely assumed the role of the leader of Egypt, but he pretty much took it as protector until eventually he solidified his power and entered the Ptolemaic period, which lasted 300 years. After, so the Ptolemies were the longest reigning name. The second longest reigning name was the Ramses. They lasted 11 names of Ramses, but the Ptolemies were considered the longest reigning names. And they lasted between 323 to 30 BC. Ptolemy Soter, which was, of course, the first Ptolemy, he established it. And then his two children. After you get to Cleopatra, Egypt from here starts to dwindle down. The Ptolemies start to break down after Cleopatra. There's a unification. The Library of Alexandria is built. Information and knowledge is brought to Egypt. I'm sure you all know about the Great Library of Alexandria. By Epiphanes and all these pharaohs, it starts to weaken. What happens is something called the War of the Roses in Europe. You get a lot of infighting. The brothers and sisters start killing each other. Brothers and sisters kill their nieces and nephews. There's a lot of intrigue. It's like a soap opera, but with blood and murder. It's a great. I said if they ever did a TV show about like a drama, do it about the Ptolemies, because it's insane the amount of atrocities they committed to each other. It's incredible, the Greeks. So anyways, just to continue on. So by this time, you can see the many different Ptolemies, and you can see, of course, the famous Cleopatra the Seventh, right over here. She is the famous last Cleopatra, last ruling of Egypt. You see 51 to 30 BC. She ruled about 21 years. But then she died. She had this. She basically tried to make a pact with Rome. Rome was on the rise. It was powerful now, and basically by this time, Cleopatra basically rules, not for very long. She eventually but gets involved with Mark Antony after Caesar is killed, and she basically gives birth to Ptolemy. No, where is he? There it is. Ptolemy Caesarion. This is the son of Cleopatra. Okay, from Caesar. When Cleopatra kills herself after Antony kills himself before she dies, these are weak rulers which don't really last. Caesarion is murdered by most likely Octavian, and that's the end of it. Egypt ends here. The culture of Egypt, in a sense, technically doesn't end here really. Not the culture, but just the power of Egypt is over. It no longer exists. What you have now is Egypt being absorbed into Rome. Now we have the Roman and Byzantium period, the second longest reigning power of Egyptian history. The Romans, in a nutshell, are ruled by Octavian. He was the first. And then by the time of Constantine, I'll just show it to you guys quickly, the Romans. So you can see the rulers of Rome, right? all the rulers of Rome by this time. And by the time you get to, here's my favorite, one of my favorite, Marcus Aurelius. He's got some great books to read on Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations. And then when you get to Constantine, this is when Christianity becomes the state religion. Constantine makes Christianity abandons all gods and makes Christianity the state religion. And that's it. And now what happens is Christianity, which was a small religion, now becomes a state religion and then has power, influence, and now it begins the slow, gradual destruction of Egypt and its culture as best as it could because it's considered pagan, evil, and so on and so forth. And you get to Justinian II by 556 to 578. This is where the last temple of Egypt, I think maybe Flavian first or second under these two Justinian, the last temple of Egypt in Philae in the south of Aswan is shut down. There are no more temples allowed, no more culture of Egypt. It's completely shut down. And now you have just Christianity ruling for 693 years. And then Byzantium is basically Holy Roman. In Byzantium, if you had Rome as the Catholic, then the Byzantium was the Orthodox. So that ruled for 770 years under the Christian rule for 70. Now comes the Islamic period. Now the age of the monotheistic religions. There were still some religions, but the Islamic religion is next, and that lasted the longest, 877 years. That was the longest. So after here it tells you pretty much, and this was ruled by the Orthodoxy, which is considered the four rightly guided caliphs. So once Muhammad died, considered in 632 AD, which is the traditional date of the death of Muhammad in Medina, you had his four caliphates, or his four famous companions, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. And when they die, eventually you have the establishment of the caliphs, and you have the Sassanid Empire, and then so on. But you begin to have the Umayyad Empire. And I'm not going to go too much into detail with this one, but what you have is basically many different dynasties of families. The Abbasid Empire, they start ruling as well. And then you have the Abbasid takes a break, and then within them, you have the Fatimids, the Ayyubids, the Mamelukes, and so on and so forth once the Abbasid caliphs are done. So once the Abbasid, so you remember these two of the Islamic period. You have the Umayyad caliphs, then you have the Abbasid caliphs, and that goes on for quite a while. And then the Tulunuds, which begin. These are the small now powers of that time, and their combination with Turkish support and help. The Tulunuds, when you get to after the Abbasids, you have a mix of Arabs, some Turkish backgrounds, some Kurdish backgrounds, some Syrian backgrounds, and the Ikshadids. You have the Fatimids, and then on and on and on. And this is pretty much Islamic period. You should read about it. It's quite extensive. Extensive period with rulers. Didn't rule for very long, the rulers themselves. I'm sure there was a lot of war and fighting. But then you get to the Ottoman rulers. The Turks now begin to take over Egypt. And that goes on and on and on. I'm going to see here under Muhammad Ali. Right, so that's it. So let's get over here. So I showed you the Islamic period under the Abbasid and the Umayyads and the other smaller factions. But then you get into the Ottoman period, the Turkish period. The Turkish period of Egypt lasts maybe about 300 years as well. And this is, of course, under 517, Egypt is conquered by Selim I in Turkey. And Egypt is basically ruled by successive Turkish rulers under Rashad, which is, I think, Muhammad Rashad is the last. And once he's gone, that's it. Let's go back. And then you get the monarchy. After the Ottomans have been booted out, after 288 years, you get the Khedival period. This is a resurgence back to Islamic period. Now, one thing about the Islamic period you need to know, there are two major schools of thought. You have the Sunni and the Shiites. The Sunnis were kind of maintained first power, and the Shiites took over, and the Sunnis took it back. And it's pretty much the Sunni power, I believe, now in ancient. And that's it, everybody. So then we get down to the Khedivs. The Khedival, Muhammad Ali basically establishes a type of power for the Pashas. I think he was known he was an Albanian Turkish gentleman, Muhammad Ali. And he basically kicked out the Ottoman forces, and Ottoman forces had to expel the Revolutionary Guard. Oh no, it was with the help of the Turks. So once the Turks got kicked out, He went back to them and asked them for help to kick out the French Revolutionary Guards. He rose to power and removed the Mamluks' power as well, Muhammad Ali. So Muhammad Ali is considered the Pasha, the reformer of Egypt. He took away all the royalty. He took away all that and basically modernized Egypt, built Cairo, established technology and medicine. He basically wanted to modernize Egypt like the West. And this is what he's known for it. What is known for it now. And then the monarchy ended with Fuad II, and that was it. The monarchy died. Egypt no longer had a monarchy, and then you get the Republic of Egypt for 50 years. So as of 1953, let's see if I can get it here, the Egyptian Islamic period. I want to see if I can get to the Khedival again. Right, so here it is. It says it right here. So Egypt eventually, Fuad II being the last monarch of Egypt from 1952 to 1953. Once he died, Egypt became a republic. But it didn't have independence just yet. However, in 1982, Egypt was occupied by the British military after the Khedive, and then in the country, and that ended the occupation in 1922. And then Egypt became a full independence in 1952. That's their Independence Day. And basically forcing the abdication of King Farouk with the abolition of the monarchy a year later. And the independence and the independence of the Republic of Egypt became in 1953 when they had their first president. And then eventually their ministers now. And that is the history of Egypt, everybody, in a nutshell. So you could see the time periods, right? From the early dynasties, how far they've gone,